Building is not an easy task. For those of you who are here for the first time, you know it's quite tough to get here. We are delighted to have with us Nawaf Obaid, who is the managing director of the Saudi National Security Assessment Project, national security consultancy based in Riyadh, private security and energy advisor to Prince Turki Al Faisal, Saudi ambassador to the United States. He's going to talk about the Iraq project report that was prepared by the Saudi National Security Assessment, and also he will talk about the implications of the situation in Iraq on Saudi national security. He sent me this morning two PDF PowerPoint, and it just I think there was a mistake, and we had the wrong one on the screen. So hopefully we'll be able to find the right one. We have had in the past meetings on relationship between Iraq and Syria, Iraq and Iran, and of course Iraq and the Persian Gulf states, but we had never had a chance to discuss Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and we are therefore delighted to have Mr. Obaid here, and he'll speak probably for 25 or 30 minutes, and then we'll have enough time for discussion, and we'll open the floor to questions and comments from you. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Ali, for having me here today. Again, I would like to apologize for being a little late. I was a bit lost in the big building. I didn't know what entrance to come in from, so my apologies. What I would like to present to you today is the final product of the Iraq project, which we did at the Saudi National Security Assessment Project for the last 2 years. And this came about by the understanding that what are the consequences of what we see happening in Iraq directly impacting on Saudi national security, and what can we expect from potentially a worst case scenario, and what potential strategies could you recommend on policy recommendations that could be adopted by the Saudi government. This is an independent assessment of which we keep on updating it every 6 months, specifically dealing with the data coming out of Iraq. So what I'll do is that I'll just briefly talk about it until hopefully the PowerPoint will be on screen so that you can have all a better understanding of where we're coming from. Initially, we identified major challenges that were confronting Iraq at the time. This was just for you to have a background, this was a project that spanned from late 2003 until today, with a major report having been issued in March of this year, so about 6 months ago. And at the time, what we did is that we identified 6 major points that would directly challenge Iraq. Obviously, the first ones are the social, economic, and security issues, which we all know of. More importantly is the Sunni-led insurgency, which have just grown in power over the last several months. And and at the same time was the Iranian interference of what we saw at the time, especially through the militias, dealing with Badr and dealing with the Mahdi militias. Great. Oh, thank you very much.
This is very, can we have it a bit larger, because I suppose nobody can see that.
This is the actual report, so not the PDF presentation.
Yeah, okay.
This is the wrong one. I'm really sorry.
Okay,
that's all we have.
That's all we have.
Not the one I sent you this morning.
Yeah, okay. I think you may have to just talk, and we'll put it on our website.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
So we initially identified 6 challenges, which were the insurgency, Iranian interference through the militias, and the uncertainty dealing with the unity, with the central unity of the Iraqi government, dealing with the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the Shia communities, and obviously the grave implications that this would have for Saudi Arabia and the region at large. We had here an ethnographic distribution which showed clearly the different communities where they were positioned in the Iraq and how they extended on the Iraqi territory. This map would show the tribes and how that directly impacts Saudi Arabia and the tribal configuration on the Saudi border. Sorry, I can't show it to you, it's here. We did a brief overview of the Kurdish, Sunni, and Shia communities. And we listed their major challenges, the realities on the ground, and where we saw these going. One of our major concerns dealing with the Kurds was obviously the general environment in which the senior leadership were operating under. More specifically, the issue of them having an end game, which is basically some form of Kurdish statehood, which was very surprising to us, considering that we had heard somewhat different messages coming out before we directly engaged with them on these topics. And they gave us as a case example what their armed forces or what their armed militias were, the Peshmerga, and how they were already looking into older maps and debating among themselves what historically constitutes Kurdish territory. And what for us was quite interesting was that their endgame is not potentially to be part of a unified Iraq or to be part of what could emerge as a new Iraq, but more specifically to have some form of, to increase this semi-autonomous region that they have today, that they're operating under. I may be able to get something out of this one. I'm just sorry because these maps are quite important in showing you all what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, that's.
In this map, you can all see it's the interesting part in these maps is, for example, if I may just get up quickly, is here. Is that along this borderline lies a huge confederation, which we call the Summer Confederation, which stretches from Syria all the way across the main Iraqi heartland into Saudi Arabia, and it's actually named after a mountain in the middle of Saudi Arabia. And this is one of the major issues that the Saudi leadership looks at because of the fact that there is a lot of senior officials from these tribes, and specifically dealing with King Abdullah, who has a lot of family ties to a lot of families which emanate from this specific tribe. And this tribe happens to be the largest tribal confederation in Iraq, which groups Sunni as well as Shia members. Following up on the Kurdish issue, this is a map that was actually given to us, of which we've made some rectification about, on where the Peshmerga were focusing on what it would be considered potential Kurdish territory for a future form of statehood. And as you can see, the major point of contention would be centered around the Kirkuk area, where the huge oil deposits are located. Here. And this would form the backbone of any potential future Kurdish state. What we found specifically surprising about this is the way that they had already progressed towards this issue. That was done around 6 months ago, so we were hoping that something would change. And in the last couple of weeks, if some of you have already seen, they've already put up Kurdish flags in areas which originally had only Iraqi flags, or just Iraqi and Kurdish, but now the Iraqi flags have started to come down. So this was one of our most important discoveries dealing with the Kurdish issue at the time, and the future of what Kurdistan and what generally the Kurdish leadership would like to perceive themselves in what could become a semblance of a united Iraq. I'm just skipping through it quickly so that I can give you as much question and answer sessions at the end. Then we get into the Shiite overview, and by far the majority of the Iraqi of the three different Iraqi communities, by far the biggest one is obviously the Shiite. We've given them an estimate of around 65% of the population, which some people say we're being too nice to them. But this was in order to be able to work with them and to be able to engage them in the kind of work we do. We have to give some form of appreciation for the data they feed us. So we went with 65. We're more likely to be around 60%. But our major concern, especially from a Saudi perspective, is the fact that their key institutions are heavily influenced and financed by certain elements within the Iranian government. And more importantly, we've seen that there are two major centers of power, so to speak, which have to do with their militias, which are the Badr organization and the Mahdi militia, have not only been financed, but in some cases have been trained and created by what is known today as the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And we'll get into this in a bit about the state of the interaction between the two sides and how far they've come in being more or less a segment or an outreach organization of certain Iranian charities. Oh, great! Thank you very much. The Shia agenda, as we see it, at the time they were very much talking about the Kurdish example of what the Kurds have been able to do in the north, and so what they perceived as being one of their major policy option was to actually form some kind of similar entity in the south. At the time, it was 6 months ago, and it was just being debated. But what surprised us more in the last couple of weeks is that they actually passed the bill through Parliament, although it was quite difficult for them to pass it, and they passed it to form some sense, although it's been delayed now. But the issue from our perspective was the fact that the environment, the ideological environment, is there for such actions. And so what basically it implies is that there's going to be a consolidation of all the south of Iraq under some form, which is still to be determined, some form of semi-autonomous entity, which will group basically all of Iran's major oil fields in one grouping. And so this is the last point that we were very concerned about, was the fact that they passed that bill, which would grant a large autonomy to the major southern Shia regions. The major political parties, as I initially briefly mentioned, is obviously Syria, and by fact Syria is by far has the biggest base of support, and at the same time they have the largest militia, which is very important, especially in today's chaos-prone situation in Iraq. The Sadrs, or Muqtada Sadr, and his Mahdi army have a much smaller base of support, yet they're still a major force to reckon with, especially dealing that they have quite a sizable Mahdi army, which is expanding, although much less organized and much less funded and operationally capable than the Badr organization. The other one, which is somewhat still influential politically but has no power base, and this is the Dawah Party, which at the time was led by the former Prime Minister Ibrahim al-Jafari. This we get into the Iranian interference issue in Iraq. What we've seen is that, especially dealing with the Badr organization, it is basically a creation of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and it's been trained, financed, and is still very heavily supported by them. Obviously, this is a big concern from a Saudi perspective because of the consequences that we're seeing today in Iraq. For example, we've been able to assess and viably determine the infiltration of newly created military and police forces by Shia officers of the Badr Brigade at the time that were closely tied with the IRGC, which is the Revolutionary Guard, and certain elements of a different service within the Iranian administration, which is the Ministry of Intelligence. More importantly, on the soft part, which is not the hard intervention, are the huge Iranian government charities, which have been able to fund and distribute quite an amount of support. Now, from an Iranian perspective, this is actually positive, and they're actually doing some good work in Iraq. So I don't want to be construed as this being some form of negativeness, but this is just what we've assessed, and obviously we have concern from the Saudi side. But to their credit, the Iranian charities have actually been doing a lot of good work for their respective communities in Iraq. More specifically, the major force involved in Iraq today is the Quds forces, which basically serve as a special division of the Revolutionary Guard in unconventional warfare, and they have been the ones that were the primary supporters of the Badr organization and in supporting the infrastructure as it went over from Iran into Iraq after the U.S. invasion and the fall of Saddam Hussein. What we were very concerned about was the fact that there were certain mid-level officers of the Al-Quds forces that were directly linked to what were at the time known as the death squads under the former Iraqi Interior Minister Bayan Jabr, who actually still, surprising enough, is in government today. Estimated strength around 5,000, and these are just ballpark figures. They may be a bit bigger. The largest of all the Iraqi Shia militias is obviously the Badr organization, the best trained, the best funded, and the ones that have the most operational capabilities as a potential fighting force. And a lot of the mid to senior members of the new Iraq forces actually come from this organization, and they've shown some pretty remarkable skills and techniques in combat operations. To a lesser level, yet still a force to be reckoned with. Lesser level in terms of training, in terms of logistical operations, in terms of infrastructure in Iraq is the Mahdi army, and they've been more the ones responsible for a lot of the chaos that we see today. And a lot of them have defragmented. They don't have a solid command and control system as do the other one, but they're still a very big force to reckon with, and they're sizable in what they're ultimately capable to do. And now this is where one of our major focus was the issue of Iranian government charities that came in to construct new mosques, welfare centers, schools, buying up land through respective Iraqi businesses in order to propagate, a welfare system. And in most cases, what we've seen, which is very interesting, is that a lot of the places where, for example, the American troops had come in and fought the insurgency or certain militias attached to the Mahdi army, these charities came in after to do some sort of repair, to be able to start up some form of welfare system and putting in like a new sewage system or bringing water to a respective district and so forth. So from their work in Iraq, from an Iranian perspective or from an Iraqi perspective, they've been doing some pretty good work, and I would like to stress this again. The Shia future in Iraq, obviously, it's obviously revolves around, what is naturally their own right, which is the fact that they are the majority community in Iraq, and hence should be the major force to reckon with. And I think there's no surprise in all that. Yet the only factor which kind of has scuttled a lot of their initial aims and objectives has been the insurgency, which now we will get into very quickly. The Sunni overview, I left it to last night because it's the least important, because it's actually the most important, and it's the most detrimental to a potential unified Iraq. Again, I have a population figure of 12 to 15. There may be a little more, but we just wanted to be on the conservative side of things, so not to make, although the problem is already as big as it is, we didn't want to even exaggerate it even more. So we wanted to try to put a picture as coherent as we could. And I said this insurgency presents a major threat to any potential lasting peace and stability in Iraq. the insurgency, and this is where we come on to. Unlike what a lot of people initially believed, where the insurgency came from abroad and was financed by other governments and so forth, this actually isn't the case. The insurgency is mainly a homegrown phenomenon, with a lot of its leaders coming directly from the officer corps, of what we loosely define as an officer corps, who were the senior military officers of Saddam's armed forces and security services, and hence why the insurgency has been so resilient, has grown in power, and has been so well funded, and how it keeps on increasing in strength. They know the areas, they know the logistical support routes, they know when to attack, when not to attack, and it's been quite remarkable the way they've been able to adapt to the new situation created by the U.S. invasion in such a short time. Obviously, the main issue is the fact that they have a huge base of support among Iraq's native Sunni population, especially among the big tribes that I initially referred to at the beginning of the presentation. Although the real level of support in the Sunni community is unknown, we do believe that it was very large at that time. And now, with the new updates, we believe that it's actually been indigenized, that we have not only an indigenized insurgency, but we also have a radicalized insurgency, which has messed quite closely with certain al-Qaeda elements and operations. This is vaguely what at the time we thought was the composition of the insurgency, of what we usually refer as the insurgency, and we see that a wide majority of them do come from the secular, that came from the Ba'athis, from the Saddam Fedayeen, and from the various security and armed forces that were making up the Iraqi armed forces at the time before the invasion. We have this, I do expect this has increased since our last update, and we've been getting more updates on the number of foreign fighters coming in from neighboring countries to fight. A fast overview of the al-Qaeda in Iraq. Again, the al-Qaeda initially developed more or less as an infrastructure as it had in its sister organization in Saudi Arabia at the time, where the idea of an overall commander is really an idea that was put out in the Western press, and we were never really able to track one specific commander. Also, a lot of them, although several of them successively said that they were in Iraq, but that there were numerous leaders, and each one operated differently and had its own fighters, including logistical support, recruitment, and training. And at the time, what we did is that we were able to track down numerous of the different commanders and their nationality. And what was interesting in this, if you see in point 2, was the fact that we had identified an Egyptian, which, after the death of Zarqawi, claimed the mantle of leadership of the al-Qaeda network in Iraq. But what we were able to determine was the fact that the most important of those leaders was actually an Algerian, who commanded the most troops, who commanded the most people under arms, the largest networks of logistical support, and by far the largest network of support in and outside of Iraq. The foreign insurgents, I guess the only major point here to note is the fact that by far the largest contingent that we've been able to assess coming into Iraq is actually North Africa, and more specifically Algerians. And this has to do with the fact that a lot of them were left over of the violent civil war in Algeria, specifically the Shia and the GSPC, and that a sizable amount of them had actually fought in the other civil wars of Eastern Europe, and then had obviously had a lot of training in Afghanistan. This is more or less how we see our updated figures for the foreign insurgency makeup. This is based on figures that have come from estimates from the host governments on how much they believe are their independent nationals in Iraq. Again, we haven't really questioned these numbers because we don't really have a way to independently verify how true they are. But this is more or less how we see. And it's funny because the same countries are the ones that are listed in the U.S. military accounts of that. The only thing that differs is their classification and their numbers. The U.S. have a lower number of foreign insurgents than we do. Finally, this is the chain. This is how we've been able to track the different foreign fighters over since the inception of the project back in September of 2005, and how it's been going up in number and not decreasing how some people have been asserting that it has. You'll see by far the largest contingent are the Algerians, followed closely by the Syrians. And that would make sense because Syria is just the country next door where a lot of the base of the insurgency is based in. And then finally, which we see as potential challenges to Iraqi unity. Again, the Kurdish issue is a big one. The insurgency will continue to be the major destabilizing force along with the Shia militias, which have obviously their own agenda, and some of them are heavily influenced by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And so our bleak assessment of the situation puts that Iraq is currently in a state of war, in a state of civil war, and that it's just a matter of time before the slow process of disintegration makes that the central state in reality becomes a failed Iraqi state as we know it today. It's very bleak, and we hope that we're wrong. It's not that we really have a say, because on the contrary, Saudi interest is for the exact opposite to happen. But this is unfortunately what so far we've been able to assess as being the case. And finally, we've been able to put some key policy recommendation from a Saudi perspective, what it could do, and some of them have actually been adopted, dealing specifically with having better communication on the situation with the U.S., which has happened. Currently developing a comprehensive strategy for worst-case scenario, which is in the course of happening. Counter-meddling in Iraq by Iran. This is a very difficult position because there are a lot of different forces in Iran that, in a way, operate independent of each other. There's been an Grand Ayatollah Sistani has been extended a state visit to Saudi Arabia several weeks ago, which he turned down, citing security concerns in Iraq. Currently, the King of Saudi Arabia has given the authorization to forgive practically all of Iraq's debt, which is important because Saudi Arabia was historically Iraq's single largest creditor. The issue of appointing an ambassador, that's still being shelved because of the current situation, although that would be a big boost for the two countries' relationships. Create a permanent border committee, which has been established, and now, if some of you have heard, we will be constructing a huge fence on that border. I'm not sure. From my perspective, I do believe it's a good short-term solution to it, but obviously not a long-term, because I don't ultimately believe that this will be able to stop what actually will happen in Iraq from developing, from staying just in Iraq's borders. And at the time, we had thought of giving the guidance of the Saudi counterterrorism program and how well it worked in taking out the Al-Qaeda network in Saudi Arabia, to give some form of advice to the Iraqis. But since then, the insurgency has developed in such a way that I don't even believe that a counterterrorism program could actually defeat the insurgency at this point. So I guess our last point has been voided by the fact of what has been happening over the last couple of months. So I'm sorry if I went very fast through this presentation. I know it's a very bleak assessment, and I'm sorry if it's not very positive in general. And I'll be open for any questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Yes, just a minute. Thank you very much. Nawaf, you gave us an overview of the situation in Iraq as you see it, and then you ended with these recommendations, and some of the recommendations are in progress. Does in progress mean that the Saudi government is speaking to the Iraqi government, or are they speaking at the same time with the Iranians, as well as the other players, with the United States, with whom? I mean, what does in progress mean,
For example, in some cases these recommendations were started before this was issued and since they've been issued, and they're not directly linked to this report or to this project. There's not, but there has been a lot of progress been made on certain of these recommendations that we had at the time put.
Let's take the example of counter-meddling by Iran in progress. If you could elaborate
for example,
on that, what's going on the ground?
On a monthly basis, there are numerous meetings that happen between Iranian officials and Saudi officials, most of the time mainly in Saudi Arabia. And we try as much as to have frank discussions with the Iranians on what's going on in Iraq and so forth. And we get a very good level of response for them and promises of cooperation. but one of the major facts that we've realized is that there's always a difference between what's being said at the official rhetoric level and what's happening on the ground. And this has been a big concern for us. And we do realize that there are different centers of power in Iran that, in a way, have their own policies and agendas. But this is one of our bigger issues, and to be honest, we're not really sure that we're making much of a difference on that level at this point.
Saudi Arabia and Iran have relatively good
absolutely,
relations.
Absolutely,
So
absolutely. But what we've been able to ascertain is that the people that are in charge of these covert operations in Iraq are not the ones that we talk to, or are not the ones that they talk to the outside world. And so we have very good relations with the current government. But the current government does not mean the Revolutionary Guard and does not mean certain elements within the Ministry of Intelligence. So we do realize the shortcomings and our limits to how we can have any form of influence on that, as are in other countries. But in other countries, for example, the other issue of extending a visit to Grand Ayatollah Sistani, that went through, and unfortunately he was not able to make it as well as the other Grand Ayatollahs in Iraq. Mm-hmm. And we thought that this would be a good move in order to bring the two sides, the senior clergy from both communities, and to come up with some form of document, which happened. But unfortunately, the wrong people, not the right caliber people, or the senior levels were there in order to be able to make what we believed would be a difference at the time. And actually, this conference didn't really serve much because the fighting, instead of decreasing, increased. And others, the best one would be the border committee, which basically has taken into consideration that there is no security on the Iraqi side, and hence decided to do this fence and to basically seal that border to prevent, the little militants we still have left of going and fighting there, and at the same time to be able to stop a lot of the drug trafficking and a lot of the illegal contrabands that are now coming through the Iraqi border into Saudi Arabia.
Could I ask you to wait for the microphone and identify yourself? Yes. Take one question from this side, one question from that.
Hi, I'm Bob Dreyfus. I'm writing a piece for The Nation magazine on Iraq, and I've talked to some of the people involved with the insurgency, and they say that they're very confident that if the U.S. were to begin withdrawing from Iraq, that the Sunni side of the conflict would have an overwhelming military advantage, and that seemed to be true from the figures that you presented of 77,000 fighters against some much smaller militia forces. And I'm getting the same from U.S. intelligence people that I've talked to that say that the Sunnis are the better trained and more skilled military. So I'm wondering if you've carried forward your Civil War research or thinking to determine where the balance of power lies in that case, and therefore how the Shiite leadership today might look toward an American withdrawal, what it would look like. Would they be afraid, or would they be sort of itching to, go on the offensive against the insurgency, like Abdulaziz Hakim often says, just let us go after them and we can take care of this insurgency?
Yeah, this is an excellent question. Obviously, the demographics are such that they would favor the Shias. But what is the case, and you very accurately describe it, is that a lot of the insurgency is actually made up out of officers that have fought, that have fought the U.S. in Kuwait, that have fought the Iran-Iraq war. They're trained, they're basically career military men, as well as their respective fighters when the U.S. came in and disbanded the Iraqi army. So it's not as clear as, for example, what Abdulaziz Hakim said, or Muqtada Sadr, which he has been even more vocal about it, that we would go in and take care of them. No, we do see that if the U.S. does begin a phased withdrawal of Iraq, it will be a disaster, because that would actually completely be an open civil war. And through fighting, nothing will be settled. It will be a deadlock. The fact that the Shias are more in numbers, but that are much less skilled and don't have the experience and the networks that the officer corps networks have. So this is why one of our major worries, as from a Saudi security standpoint, is to do everything we can in order to hope that the U.S. does not have a premature withdrawal at this point, because that would be tantamount to a disaster. And if I can quote from Prince Turki, the current Saudi ambassador in the U.S., I mean, he laid it out very very intelligently by saying that the U.S. came into Iraq uninvited, and that they should not leave uninvited, because this is clear. They do leave, and the whole thing will basically go up in arms. And this is exactly because the Shias will not be able to defeat the Sunni insurgency. This is they are believing it, but this is something that is the U.S. were not able to do it, and certainly not the Shia militias are going to be able to do it. And this is why we hope that the U.S. stays in as long as is needed.
Dave?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm Dave Pollack from the State Department. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I'm interested in it as a follow-up to what you just said, in your at least preliminary assessment of what you think U.S. policy will actually be in Iraq. I understand the Saudi preference that you've just explained, but given what happened this week and so on, whether you have some sense of where you think U.S. policy will go and what the Saudi reaction to that might be. As another aspect of that, the Iraqis that I've met with often complain privately that although Saudi Arabia says that it would like to see a more capable, secure, unified Iraqi government and state, that they're not actually doing very much on the ground to support the Iraqi government in terms of economic assistance that's actually delivered, or other ways, diplomatic or political support, other ways in which they might help the Iraqi government function better and establish greater authority in the region. Can you please comment on that issue as well? Thank you.
I'll take the first part. I'll answer the first question. The second part of your question first. The issue with direct Saudi dealings with Iraq has always been, we've always very carefully coordinated this with the U.S. For example, we have a huge Iraq aid package waiting. I think it's actually the single largest of any country. But the question we have, as we have with the other aid packages we have, for example, for the Palestinians, or we had for Lebanon, but now Lebanon's been dispersed because there is a central viable authority there to assume the responsibilities of disbursing these monies. In the Iraq situation, who will we give it to? And especially from what we hear from the respective senior Sunni tribal leaders that come to Saudi Arabia, is the fact that a lot of the money is going to specific Shia districts and Shia communities, which is fine if that's what they want to do, but this doesn't mean that the Saudi government is going to necessarily agree to this. And so what we've done is that a lot of that money is actually being held up in escrow accounts and is just waiting for some semblance of central authority which could actually act upon this. And in having a more direct role in Iraq, we don't see that we could have, for example, a more direct role like Iran has with the militias without directly undermining the U.S. position there. Hence, King Abdullah has very wisely stopped on any initiatives by the respective Sunni tribal leaders in Iraq, or by other people that come to Saudi Arabia very often these days, practically every week now, to ask for direct assistance in order to be able to form some form of a defense service or defense army or what have you, in order to counter what they see as the insurgency, one, and two, as the Shia militias. But that puts us in a more complex situation, because one, if the Saudi government does do this, you will directly be undermining the American position, which is exactly what the Saudi government does not want to do. And secondly, we believe that a lot of that money, if it does go to these people, will ultimately end up with some elements of the insurgency that will attack the U.S. and foment even a larger civil war at a faster pace.
Yes. Sure.
Stanley Kober with the Cato Institute. How would an attack on the Iranian nuclear facilities affect what you call the meddling?
A direct attack, or any sort of how the Iranians would perceive it as an attack by the U.S. at this point, would only exasperate, the situation in Iraq. We always see it, because this is part of the second project we're doing. We always see it as this strategy of, if you want to take care of the nuclear program, you will have to let go of Iraq, and the Iraq situation will be irreversibly lost, because any attack or any semblance of Iran under siege, and logically, and what we've been able to hear and to listen to what some Iranian officials have said privately, I mean, they would turn the Iraq situation much more out of control than it already is. So the other hope is that there is not a precipitous attack by the U.S. on any facilities in Iran, especially at this point.
I'll move both. Yes.
Dave Rogers, independent historian. You have confirmed that at least some of the foreign insurgents are Saudis. Would you address the question of how much concern does the Saudi government have that these people are going to bring the war home at some point in the future and wage an insurgency against the current government of Saudi Arabia?
Thank you. This was an initial. This issue was initially vastly exaggerated by the numbers of Saudis that were in Iraq and by what they were able to do. Through this project that we've been doing over the 2 years, we've been able to identify, I would say, by far a vast majority of the actual Saudis that went there, or that they went there directly from Saudi Arabia or through a second country, or coming in from a third party, which in most cases would be implying coming in from Afghanistan. There's been some Saudis that have miraculously come back to Saudi Arabia, but what we found very interesting is that they did not come back to fight. They basically came back to be able to lay low and not get themselves in trouble or not be caught by the security services, because now it is a crime in Saudi Arabia to actually go and fight in the insurgency in Iraq. So we've been able to catch several, of which two of them, in that report that Hali has, I put a case study at the back of them recounting their journey from Saudi Arabia into Iraq, what they've done in Iraq, and subsequently have they made it back. We obviously have a concern that some of them could always come back and try to wage war. But if we see the pattern has been that as the Saudi counterterrorism program has been so successful in dismantling and taking away the Al-Qaeda networks in Saudi Arabia, we've had several of the commanders that were not killed escape to Iraq. And this has been a concern for us, because the whole purpose of constructing this fence, or one of the main purposes of constructing that fence and sealing that border for the last 2 years, was to prevent any potential militants from going to Iraq, because we believe that we have a much better chance of catching them in Saudi Arabia. So it is a concern, but it is not, we don't believe that there is a high probability at this point that they could come back and be able to establish a new network to be able to carry out any terrorist operation.
Yes, could we have the mic?
Hi, Samira Daniels. I'm interested in interfaith issues primarily, but Islam as well. If you could, and you may or may not have researched this, could you identify what the Sunni insurgency hopes? I mean, it must make some noises about what it would like to do. That's one thing. And two, what are the motivations of the foreign constituencies there that have come to fight? I mean, if you have some kind of ordering of that, I would be interested in knowing those two.
From what we've been able to ascertain is that the insurgency is dead on having the Americans leave. That's their number one. That's their number one aim. And two is to be able to battle it out with the Shias, which they perceive as being surrogates for Iran, and they're unwilling to even for Iran.
Iran.
Yes, for Iran. Yes, and rightfully or wrongfully. I mean, this is not for us to make the judgment, but it's just from how they perceive it. And so when we've asked them, so would you be interested? Is there a potential middle ground where you'd be interested in being part of a united Iraq? They're dead on that. That's a big no. They do not see themselves as being able to be in a united Iraq where the leadership would be a Shia-led leadership. So this is also another alarming point that we were able to hear with utter shock. I'm sorry.
No follow-up, please. Yes, please.
My name is Heather Bentz. I'm a Middle East consultant. The Iranian Defense Minister, Najjar, has made an overture for a Gulf state defense pact. Do you see a way to leverage that in combination with the Baker Commission recommendations on further engagement, more engagement with Iran and Syria on the borders to increase the secure situation in Iraq?
I mean, no, the short answer is obviously no. I mean, we don't really, which is unfortunate at this point. Any measure that comes of any measure of stability that comes, including Syria, for example, and to be fair, certain elements within the Iranian administration, because we're very clear on that. When we're very clear on not to say Iran as general, in a general context, because we do realize there's a lot of different centers of power there. But no, we wouldn't really take this proposition very seriously at this point. No.
Yes, in the back. And
Hi, Josh Yaffe, National Defense University. I had a question about Syria. So, okay, very good. Do you see it as a high priority in Riyadh to build cooperation with Syria, especially when there's been a lot of bickering back and forth in the media this year between al-Watan and Syrian officials visiting, and relations have been on and off, but on a purely diplomatic level and a purely surface media level. Is that serious, divisions between Syria and Saudi Arabia? Are they building cooperation? What's the future prospects for that? And more importantly, is the U.S. supporting cooperation between Syria and Saudi Arabia?
No, I mean, ever since the Bashar speech right after the war in Lebanon, King Abdullah has pretty much written him off. So there's been, I think, 2 or 3 times there's been a demand for Bashar to come to Riyadh to explain himself and present some form of apology, and that was rejected. And then he was willing to send 2 or 3 of his close aides to Riyadh at a lower level to explain and to extend some form of apology, and that was also rejected. So there is no real cooperation on anything right now, and now it's just being added by what we perceive as Syrian policy towards Lebanon and towards the fact that they're trying to undermine the Senora government, which is really, we see it from a U.S. perspective, as I understand from U.S. officials, and from a Saudi perspective, is that we see it as really the last chance to be able to save Lebanon from what would be looming a serious internal crisis. And as you know, a lot of the Saudi aid, which is now by far the largest single aid, which is over $1.7 billion, is all centered around Fuad Senora being able to stay in power and to get working on reconstructing what is basically reconstructing the whole country after this terrible war. And that kind of puts into perspective where we're not very sure about how, for example, Syria or Iran claim that they have actually beaten the Israeli army. But that's another question. Thank you.
Yes, here and there.
My name is Nadia Saad. I'm World Bank retired. I cannot hear from what you said. What is the vision or the wish or the goal of the Saudi government as to how it would like the Iraq problem to be resolved? Number one, the Shia community in Saudi Arabia, how strong is it and what is its position towards what is happening. We hear that, of course, Saudi Arabia interest would be in helping the Sunnis because it wouldn't like to have a Shia crescent around its border. So how are you dealing with your Shia community? How strong is it? And what is the general policy? If you can say it in clear terms.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Obviously, there isn't a clear policy now because no one really has a clear policy on what to do with Iraq. But the realization from the Saudi leadership is that there is a complete acceptance that by fact that the Shias are the largest community in Iraq, that they should be the ones that should be leading that government, especially if it's democratically elected. So again, what you hear and what you read in some presses is not usually reflects the exact opposite of what's going on in the ground in the region, and this shouldn't be a surprise to many of you. So absolutely not. There is not this question about sectarianism there, especially with King Abdullah. He's realized this, that democratically elected, the Shias would be in power, and we don't have a problem with it. In relation to our respective communities, there's been a lot of reform dealing with them and how the way that they are to be assimilated in Saudi society, especially since the current king, took power, and there's been a huge step towards that. Especially if you hear Prince Turki admitting that the Shia community in Saudi Arabia have been marginalized, have not been have been discriminated against, and so forth. So there is this huge realization that the Shias, at the end of the day, especially the ones in Saudi Arabia, are Saudis and are Arabs, and unlike what other Arab leaders have claimed to say about the Shias, which we don't share their opinion at all. Having said that, this is part of this other project that we're currently doing, is to be able to assess the Shia communities in the Gulf, and more specifically in the kingdom. They are obviously by far not as big as people have made them out to be, or as powerful, especially in Saudi Arabia. Yet they are Arabs, they are Saudis, and having said that, there is no excuse for them not beginning to be fully part of the Saudi system.
I will take one last question here, please.
Thank you, Edward Eagles. I frankly am stunned by the figure of 77,000 plus insurgents on the Sunni side. Could you delve into that a bit more?
Sure.
What that number incorporates, whether those are people only with military training, whether they include people who might have in any way had some encounter with conducting violence and so forth?
Absolutely. We've got that number by speaking directly to the senior tribal leaders, the Sunni senior tribal leaders that often visit Saudi Arabia. And then we've talked in Jordan with the senior Iraqi officers that or have gone to Jordan or are actually in Syria. And if you just talk, and this is a conservative number, because if you just take their numbers during the Saddam era, you will see that how high in hundreds of thousands the actual armed forces were. So we took it as being on the conservative side by having estimates by these generals. So they all gave us their respective estimates of what they believed their respective units and how much of their respective units at the time they believe are actually engaged in the insurgency. And then we went to the tribal chiefs and said, okay, how much do you believe of your respective families or lineages, or because the tribes then divide into segments, and there's Arabic terms for that, and then divides into families and subfamilies and so forth. And then we just tallied the total up. So it's obviously it's a rough estimate, but this is an estimate we've had for a year now, and we believe that this is actually a very conservative estimate, and we would expect it to be much higher at the present time.
Nawaf, thank you very much. I suppose you shocked everybody with your figure of 77,000, which is, quite surprising and shocking. Nobody expected that figure, but we hope to see you again back soon at the
Sorry
center.
for having been late.
And my apologies for this. Yes, we'll put it on our website, and then you can download it. Yes?
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. You're welcome. Yeah, I spoke to her today. I spoke to her. I'll send her an email. But she's coming.
Yeah, I'm going to have
No, I was in New York last week, but I'm here all next week. Syria. I don't have a car, though. Right into
I'll see your mom on Tuesday. She comes here to have breakfast with me once a month.
Thank you for coming. Sorry if I was late, but getting into this place is a real
We
nightmare.
have told people with us. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Josh, we'll be in touch.
Would you believe?
Yeah, no, she is here. Okay. But I'll see you next week, if not before.
Here we go. And I'll write you my international cell. That's the one I'm using here now. And we could always meet. I'm staying at the Four Seasons, so we could meet there.
Is this
No,
O-B-A-D-I?
O-B-A.
Oh, I, okay, right. Like your name as well.
Yeah, and A will help.
44778641. Yeah, definitely. Thanks a lot. Did you get any of the green lights before you do?
Yeah, I mean, I'll send it to you. I think it's going to put it on the website.
I have to finish on the 20th. I guess it'll probably be out around here.
Yeah. Yes, it's actually there. They confused it. I mean, I can send it.
Yeah, no.
Just email me. Send it back.
You know,
Sure.
I think I signed a letter. I'm at Sigurd, Inspector General for Rapid Construction. I did, yeah. Well, to be honest, I have no idea. Yeah, Dave. But then also, just as I was transitioning from that job to the job at Sigurd, Someone else emailed me. You sent me somewhere around May Park. Yeah, I think that was it.
It's not
James sent
No.
but I don't know if his last name was I haven't been. This is a very temporary gig over at the IG's office.
We have a table in the dining
Well, look, I'll be in touch. Good meeting you.
Thank you.
I'll give you a call. Give you a call. Talk about it, see what you think.
Yeah, I will. Sounds like exactly the kind of thing they like, but again, facing it, it's important.
Exactly.
Hitting it.
I'll see you soon. Take care. Take care.
So did you get your CT? You know, our deputy
Yes.
That's interesting.
Well, I'm not that shocked.
Lisa. Yeah, no, but that's why I asked the question.
Aw, why? Aw. Dude, holy, it's obviously her fault, not yours. But she still like, oh. You know what I mean? Like, I'm just like, I'm like out there, I'm like, oh my god, this is my phone. I want you to check my email. And I'm like, this stupid email's not in here. I'm like, did she email it? Had she emailed it to you? She has, and I asked her, like, while I was at her office, I'm like, can you email it to me again? She's like, I'm like, I didn't receive it, can you email it? She's like, I emailed it to you this morning. So I was just like, you did know you had. Yeah, so then that's when I asked you, I'm like, can you send it to me? Oh. And then she's okay, but she's, like, I was like, I know, I was like expecting her, like, no, seriously though, I was expecting her to go boom. Oh. You know, you're fired. You're doing that now. I'm like, if she had gone boom, like, I would have, like, even been like, I would have said something like that. No, it's ridiculous. No. And plus it. And then he was late, and I sent him directions this morning, and I didn't have his phone number, and I'm like, well, that's and I asked him, like, Joyce, I asked him, like, are you going to send us a PowerPoint presentation, like, as soon as I knew about the event? He's like, no. And then he sends it the morning of. The morning, no, I know. No, that's totally, that's, whatever, that's exactly his problem. He knows it, that's why. You know what? But he's making us look bad. And she looked bad, and I looked bad, and it's his fault. Yeah, I mean, that's do you understand? Yeah, like, it looked weird, like, it was being webcast. Oh, yeah, whatever, that's... I was talking to them, and they have no control over that. They said that they could cut that stuff out at the beginning. But that would... Yeah. Whatever, that's something, honestly, you shouldn't get mad at stuff you have no control over whatsoever. And if you do have control over it, also is not your fault. No, and please, Holly knows it, obviously. Like, yeah, but I didn't know that. Like, I was expecting boom. Oh, that's what I was expecting. Yeah. She obviously, Joyce. Sure, I'm ridiculous, and I shouldn't be crying in front of you. I'm sorry. No, whatever. And plus, you know what? Let's say she emailed it to you. We got it on the computer. He did his presentation. I mean, yeah, it might have exactly the whole thing with people, but that's something we have no control over whatsoever. Like, what are you going to do? Force him to email it, like, in advance? When he told you he was going to do it? Like, it's not even happen. He decides to do it last minute. I mean, what does he expect by us, too? Does he expect magically we're just, you know, get it all together in, like, 3 hours? Well, he sent it this morning. I mean, if I would have received it, then it would have been funny. But, I want to go ahead and stereotype and say it's because it's Saudi, and I'm refraining from doing so. So talk about it happened with any other. I know, but it's like I have like more than enough things to be like worrying about. You saw me this morning with the finance department. That your lady's going to be going on vacation, so I'm trying to get the compassion is for all those people.
Oh, yeah.